To introduce the exhibition by and large, I'll simply say that the exhibition was curated over 2 years by Hilton, Elms, and myself. And Hilton can't be here today, but it was a partnership that came together from both of us meeting and discovering that we both were fans of Christopher Knowles and deciding to sort of take this on together. We sort of, just to let you know the tactics of how we went about it, I decided to take on the task of going to the galleries, going to see objects, trying to figure out where things were, talking to family and friends of Christopher's, and Hilton stuck to things that he really likes to do, which are libraries and archives and hunting through, papers and looking through things on that side of things. And then we sort of did this for 2 years and slowly came together with a series of objects that we thought resonated with us and resonated with Christopher, hopefully. So, what brought me to Christopher was I've always had an interest in performance and performance tactics and artists who blend categories. And I've also always had a love of artwork that, for lack of a better term, has something to do with the quotidian, that has something that is paying attention to a lot of the overlooked things that we pass by every day. And I really think that Christopher does that excellently, and he does it not just through the subject matter of the work, but he does that with the materials that he uses and the sort of a lot of the formats that he has engaged over the decades. So, with this exhibition, the interesting thing about Christopher is that he now has his first real catalog. He's had one book of his typings that came out in the late 70s, and he had one book of drawings from a small museum show in Holland that came out in the 80s. And otherwise, there's been little bits and pieces of Christopher that come out here and there, but without many connections. Or if you're a fan of contemporary music, you might own a copy of Philip Glass's piece, Einstein on the Beach, and notice that the libretto is co-written by this name, Christopher Knowles. And so you might see the words as they come about here and there. So Hilton and I started looking at the work, and I'm coming into it through my love of sort of like the everyday. Hilton's always looking for stories, looking for ways that people tie to the world around them emotionally. And one thing that became clear to both of us as we were looking through the works that we were attracted to, the works that were out there, is that when you look at Christopher's work, you see the items that he likes. Those will be through the typewriter drawings, so you can take the typewriter as one of those. There's handmade audio collages, so you can understand words, music, and like the physical tape recorder is something he enjoys. He will paint song titles, things like Simon, a game that he's played, politicians that he thinks of, portraits of friends, portraits of Sylvia, his current partner. You'll also find letters that are written to George Klauber, letters written to Bob Wilson, letters written to his sisters Sarah, poems made for his sister Emily. So the people around him, the things around him, the world around him is really important. As Christopher's work wasn't really ever brought together in a sort of more comprehensive, bringing all his media, all his formats together, Hilton and I really also wanted to build sort of a little bit of a world of Christopher in the work, as we were also attending to the formal and the actual objects of the work. So if you're an attentive viewer to the exhibition, and I guess I'm saying these as ways to sort of give you a guide so you can do work on your own if you're interested, is that there's not a lot of wall labels that make all the maps of his life out here and available, but you'll notice the name, Dear Sarah in a letter over here. You'll notice a letter, Dear Sarah, over here, and you might notice a painting that says, party, come to our party on Fire Island. And you can start to see, sort of a family space develop. You might see the name George Klauber appear. George Klauber, again, a family friend. And so that comes a way of like entering. And so like there's these little traces of Christopher that sort of build through, and you can see who he's with, who's around him by the sort of details that are at the corners of the work. To that, but then you'll also find that as what can seem like he's simply just dealing with a personal friend or dealing with a sister, there's often also complex sort of ways of speaking, ways of thinking about the world, ways of being in the world that come through in a lot of the works. So quite often, letters to friends aren't simply just letters to friends, but they're also opportunities for artwork or for making new gestures. So two good examples of these would be here, it's a birthday letter to his sister Sarah, and then here is a thank you letter to a friend, George Klauber. So to think through this, how you'll sort of find these little bits of humor and little bits of formalism that sort of come through the work and like playfulness. You've got a birthday letter written to Sarah, wishing her a good 22nd birthday, written in 1982, but it becomes a point to do a little bit drawing and to recount sort of an apology for having pounded her birthday cake in 1970. So a good, over a decade before that, sort of returning to this thing and turning it into an image and turning it into like a gesture. The simple thank you note to George Klauber for a check for Christmas becomes at the bottom, and you'll see this in several other works as well, this code that Christopher invented. So like the entire text rewritten in a code of his own making that sort of scrambles the letters and is a code that appears in several typings, a couple of the sketchbooks over there, and sort of in the margins of lots of things. So you find a real concrete play of both personal space and formal space that often happens simultaneously through the work. Now to give a little pointers, to give a little sort of story to get people sort of settled. George Klauber was a teacher in Manhattan, taught design. One of George Klauber's students happened to be Robert Wilson, who then started the bird school, Hoffman School for Birds, which was a collaborative performance group based primarily in Lower Manhattan that involved a lot of artists, theater people, musicians, dancers that collaboratively made work. They started making work in the 60s, doing large pieces around the globe, traveling to Iran, traveling Europe to produce a lot of these things. The works were encountered a couple things: very slow movements, very grandiose uses of time, as much as 8 hours or 24-hour performances, 7-day performances, collectively authored sort of dreamlike images, but by and large they were pretty silent or maybe incidental music at most. George Klauber had kept in contact with his past student Robert Wilson as they would come up, and Robert Wilson just talked about how he was trying to find a way to he felt that language wasn't enough in the work, and how does language get in? Christopher had been given a tape recorder, had been starting making taped collages of like these little routines of poems, of phrases, of permutations of text. George Klauber heard one of those and thought, I think this would be appealing to Bob Wilson. Gave the tape to Bob Wilson. Bob Wilson said, this is exactly what I've been thinking of trying to do for language. And quickly said, can you invite him to the next performance? George Klauber explains that, well, he's 13 years old. And he said, well, invite him and his parents. So Christopher and his parents go to see Bob Wilson's performance, which was 44 years ago on Thursday. And that night, Robert Wilson invites them backstage and asks Christopher if he would like to perform in the performance beginning that night and for the rest of the run. And from that point forward, Christopher is very active in performance, very active in an experimental downtown art scene that includes artists like Paul Tech, his photograph is taken by well-known photographers such as like Peter Hujar or Robert Mapplethorpe. You have, or also Gerard Malanga, who is part of Warhol's Factory. And you have like suddenly his work is being lauded by John Ashbery and a lot of people who are sort of recognizing the sort of concreteness and playfulness of Christopher's language. And maybe, since I'm talking about language, I'll point out that what could be the sort of core of Christopher is definitely in this space. If people know Christopher's work or if they've come across it somewhere, by and large, it's probably from the typings. The typings are, some cases, very inventive and very sort of beautiful. Other cases, very sort of, you could almost say, it's easy to overlook the sort of particularity and the sort of specificity of them. to not lose track of maybe some of the largeness, like they're never quite abstract. There's always something concrete coming through the works. It was in my talking with Hilton and going back and talking through Christopher's writing, and Hilton really sees Christopher as being connected to writers like Gertrude Stein. And for example, if you look out Gertrude, how she would take a phrase, and a simple phrase, and sort of permeate it over like page, 2 pages. This is something you see a lot in Christopher's. You see a very present tense use of language, like nouns, verbs, not too many modifiers in between, and you find a very concrete relationship of things do other things, or things behave with other things. Things go and lead to other things. So you find very concrete uses of language. You also find punctuation that's very open, and a little sort of moment I had, funny enough, on the plane down here, and I don't know why I hadn't reread the essay before now, maybe because I'm a slow learner. But there's an essay, a famous essay that Gertrude Stein gave about punctuation and about the fact that she didn't use punctuation. And in Gertrude Stein's lecture, she explains, well, if you don't know I'm asking you a question by the words I've put in front of you, you're not reading carefully. And so I think you can see a lot of this sort of emphatic sort of baseness in a lot of Christopher's language. You find it very directly given. You also find it very directly being brought forward. And you also find a concentration on the things he loves. So radio and the top 20 hits and pop songs, particularly 1967. Apparently it's the best year for music. And if you don't believe me, ask Christopher. You will also find when the work doesn't sort of document things like that, you will find things like, making a sort of short play out of just, that's called A Really Angry Brother, and thinking through a simple emotion and a simple relationship to sisters and turning that into sort of a formal, inventive sort of narrative. You will find some more abstract typings using red and black keys to make pictographic images. The typings are always made out of the letter C, of course, for Christopher, as a sort of signature, as a sort of identification mark. And they will take the large, the small, everything sort of collapses together. So you'll have a typing over here. The first in this little grouping of 3 is called the 25 Pauls. You have Pauls who are friends, but you also have Pauls who happen to be McCartney or Anka and other sort of entertainers that are treated as equals to people that are, personally close to him. I like to think of the closest we can get to a portrait of Christopher might be this wall over here, where we have a typing where he recounts what he does on a typical day, and you can read it yourself. A silk screen, which is an early self-portrait Christopher drew, and then a map of Manhattan. And Christopher's story is definitely a story of having grown up in Manhattan, been a creative individual in Manhattan, and sort of working, his family being centered for a long time around Manhattan, and really being in this neighborhood. And then it ends with a very minimal typing that simply reminds you to dance, 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 dance. Christopher still loves dancing, and dancing is a perfect way to introduce the fact that Christopher, throughout the early 70s to the late 70s, is very actively performing. And you'll find in these cases scripts for performances, some performed, some not performed. You'll also find posters, signs, announcements done for his performances through the 70s. And then in this side of the museum, and we'll slowly walk, you'll find a lot of things that sort of small markers and remnants, you could say, of the very extensive performance history that Christopher had with Robert Wilson and as part of the group. Robert Wilson is a performer who's always been interested in trying to expand what it means to collaborate and who it means to collaborate and who's allowed to be an equal. So even before Robert Wilson had met Christopher, He had sometimes been working with young individuals. He had worked with individuals who were confined to iron lungs in hospitals. He had worked with amateurs as well as trained professionals. He had worked with people at every range. He's also worked with the people who are deaf and people who have, sort of otherwise are considered not to be often equal authors when it comes to performance. Robert Wilson had a speech impediment growing up, and it was an instructor who taught him to speak slowly and to concentrate on enunciating where he was going. And so in part because of Robert Wilson's thinking through the difficulty he had learning to speak, he was always interested in expanding who was allowed to lead the groups and what was considered a willing participant in energy. So within this, Christopher quickly, when he ends up performing, also ends up helping to co-write the pieces with the Byrd Hoffman group in their collaborative writing. Everybody has to lead a workshop, everybody has to lead movements together, and so no one's allowed to just be a performer in this group. Everybody at some point had to take claim of what was happening. So in this space, because you can't have people performing 100 times a day, every day, we brought together, Hilton and I, posters from some of the more sort of renowned performances, a couple stills, pieces of scripts, and then just to also let you see the difference and to think about collaboration and how something that seemingly is generic can actually have an authorship and a form to it. You can see, for example, the difference between the typings that are in this room over here, and then in this case, there is a typing which is one of Wilson's collaborators in the 70s, James New, typing and trying to transcribe Christopher's poems as Christopher's giving them. So it's sort of James New's attempt to do a similarly formally rigid typing. You also have Christopher's script and the plotting for one of the dialogue pieces based on the books of Curious George that he did with Robert Wilson in the late 70s. And you have some large notes that were used around the studio for workshops and documentation by Richard Landry, who was a saxophonist in Philip Glass's group, of a piece that Christopher did at the Whitney, and then paintings that Christopher did of one of the last of the major Wilson pieces he was a part of, Parsifal, from the mid-'80s. Also in this space, to try to give people just like a grounding for like the world that this comes from, we included the 4.5-hour video documentation of one of the last tours of Einstein on the Beach, which is the piece that Robert Wilson collaborated with Lucinda Childs and Philip Glass on, and it's definitely considered one of the hallmarks of 20th century opera, and it's one of the first abstract operas, meaning that there isn't a clear plot, and the music goes end to end for 4.5 hours and leads you onto a series of vignettes. And we just wanted the people to see, like, Christopher was a solo author, but then you can hear how his words were used and turned into stage setting and musical sort of libretto by the two of them. We also included just as little pointers to the world and how things can also still be a part of yourself. When a painting, you'll find a couple mentions. This is one of these other traces that Hilton and I liked to build the show around. This painting, John Simon, Pollute Your Anger. John Simon, a former theater critic for the New York Times, who wasn't so favorable to some of Robert Wilson's performances. And so, we shouldn't forget, that John Simon was sort of a bad critic and not sort of up to snuff by Christopher's standards. What we have in this area is a sort of it's not usually mute, it usually has a soundtrack, a sort of rendition of a stage setting that's used for a series of performances called The Sundance Kid is Beautiful that were workshopped in 2012. Christopher has continued to have a relationship, if not always with Robert Wilson as a direct performer, spending summers out at the Watermill Center in Long Island, which is a performance school workshop residency that Robert Wilson owns that also includes Wilson's collection of art objects. Christopher spends summers there making artworks. Noah Kashabin, who's known Christopher forever, wanted to sort of work with Christopher again and started working through a lot of routines, sound collages, poems, and performance pieces that Christopher had worked on through the years and bring them into sort of a solo performance. So if you ever see the performance, it's kind of a greatest hits, you could say, of Christopher, of newly written vignettes as well as some vignettes that have been taken out of the larger Wilson pieces of some of Christopher's sort of solo actions from these, and brought into like a sort of 90-minute performance that stages sort of different moments of the day. You could say a day in the life of Christopher Knowles, almost. So if you come to the gallery on a normal time, you'll hear playing over the speakers a tape collage that's been made out of several of Christopher's audio recordings from the years. So a couple that are sort of more formally sort of abstract, and a couple that are sort of his rhythmic repetitions of poems and language. Now I think, gosh, I hate talking about artists when they're in the room, but Christopher did learn to speak by a school that tied learning of language to movements, to physical movements of the body. So like mirroring actions, you moved your actions, then you learned words at the same time that you were learning motor skills and learning sort of different, putting through different physical repetitions. And so for me, it makes sense that sort of Christopher starts at the young age as an artist, sort of exploding into language, but a language that treats words almost as physical parts of the body. So you get words permutations, you get sentences where verbs are like a simple substitution of noun verb changes meaning and is sort of rotated through until the pattern comes back to the beginning again. And it makes total sense then that language so naturally goes to a sort of performative action and sort of a performance of sort of behaviors. And maybe I'll leave performance at that, unless people have questions later. But I bring up the physicality because I think the physicality is important to the paintings as well, because an aspect of the paintings, and I can't look at the typewriter, for me it's very distinct that when I look at the typewriter drawings, I sort of, for myself, plug in the sound of a typewriter. And the fact that a typewriter isn't a computer, it isn't a silent object, it's something that checka, 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 checka. And the same thing with, you'll see in the stage set, the tape recorders that Christopher often uses for his sound pieces. They have very physical buttons. It's a very physical way of editing tape. It's like on, off, forward, backwards, return. In the paintings, most of them are made using a paint marker. And so paint marker, as opposed to a brush where the paint is viscous, can be thicker, thinner, the paint marker is very akin to drawing and very akin to, like, if you want a wide swath of color, you have to actually do it physically. And so there's a very emphatic aspect to like making something with a paint marker that's very distinct from a lot of painting. And so it makes them much more built piece by piece. It also makes them very puzzle-like. And so you can see how the paintings are sort of come together. You also, if you're attentive to the surfaces of the paintings, will notice there's no pencil lines. There's no things of sort of studies of, you don't see traces of underpainting that lead to the final composition. You see compositions that have been made to set their frame to frame, edge to edge, and sort of assembled almost like a puzzle, almost like physical pieces that come together, or maybe like Legos, for which there's a couple Lego flags on display in the other side of the gallery. And I have to check time because I get off time a lot. It's been close to half an hour, so, but maybe we'll slowly come this way a little bit. And I'll just lead you into a couple other things that you can sort of take when the show comes back to life. And that will be, Christopher has a dry but deliberate sense of mischievous humor. And I think that is something that's very much at play when the video that's on the other side of this wall, the Watch movie, is playing. It's a short 5.5-minute audio tape of a sort of short vignette that Christopher wrote. And then that was taken by the film director Richard Rutowski and made into a little short video in the early 80s. And so Richard's sort of turning this audio tape into a story for film. And you can also see a documentary sort of picture into how Christopher makes things, Sunshine Superman, which is also by Richard Rutowski, on the wall over there. And I'll simply point out that in the film, you see Christopher make a couple tape recordings, you see some typings being made, you see him performing. You'll happen to see the sun that's hanging above it. You'll see a couple of pieces that are over here. You'll see him making a Lego flag. And so you really get a sense from that film of how the work is made. And I see that work as like a really nice entry into getting a sense of the tactility of what it is to make the work.